Open your Bibles to Psalm 83. Psalm 83 opens up by saying, "Keep not thou silence, O God, keep not thou silence. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God." Now, those of you who heard me preach on this, there's many messages in the Last Day series, or both video and print. I'm not going to be preaching on this tonight. God will not be silent. He will not hold his peace. There is a day of reckoning coming for the Arab world. For lo, thy enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people. And I've broken this down before. Thy people would be the tribe of Judah, the ones there now in Israel and the Middle East, and consulted against thy hidden ones. There's a prophetic prophecy to the northern tribes of Israel, which would be taken into slavery and then lost in history, supposedly. I'm not going to get into all that tonight. But the battle line prophesied many thousands of years ago for the Middle East today and in the future is between the chosen and the hidden ones against the Arab world. In this prophecy in Psalm 83. And just because we have a lot of different distractions now here in this country, with Supreme Court, potential justice, and everything else, doesn't mean what's happening in the Middle East today should be ignored because of current situations here in this country. These things will come and go. The corruptions of Republicans and Democrats alike will come and go. But what was set in stone, in this case in God's written word, concerning Psalm 83, and everything that I preached about in this psalm, spending weeks and months on it, will come to pass. But it yet not has happened the way it's described here in this psalm. The Arab world, especially the Arab world around Israel, is still plotting. They're still consulting amongst themselves, the different Arab nations, how they can make, according to scriptures, a tumult. So the name of Israel be no more in remembrance. Well, I got news for them. They're the ones going to wind up being no more in remembrance. But things are happening there, and I can't get into details, all the things. On the news side, if I was just going to give you the news and what's happening in the Middle East on a day-by-day blow of what's happening there, it would take up all my time. I just can't do that. Not at this time. But when something comes across my desk and I see that it has some importance to relate to you, then I will do that. This is from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's titled The Great Middle Eastern War of 2019. So as I read this, whether it's 2019 or a latter year, this should not be surprising to you for those of you who went through the Psalm 83 teaching with me. This is some of the things that need to happen for that psalm to be fulfilled. Let me just read it because I'm running out of time and it's quite lengthy. Far from simply relaying the 2006 Lebanon War, replaying the 2006 Lebanon War, the next conflict on Israel's northern frontier will likely involve many more actors on multiple fronts, raising unprecedented challenges for escalation management. Just not an attack from Hamas, in other words. Those still might happen. Just not an attack from, let's say, Hezbollah. Just not an attack from Syria. But this whole article and report is saying that there's going to be multiple fronts which Israel will have to deal with all at one time. Growing tensions on Israel's northern border has raised concern about yet another Israel-Hezbollah confrontation or a war between Israel and Iran in Syria. Such a war may not be limited to the original participants, but could involve an array of Shia militias and even the Assad regime, and could span the region, thereby affecting vital U.S. interests. Two factors are driving these tensions: efforts by Hezbollah in Syria, with Iran's help, to produce highly accurate missiles in Lebanon and Syria that could cripple Israel's critical infrastructure and make life there intolerable, and Iran's effort to transform Syria into a springboard for military operations against Israel and a platform for projecting power in the Levant. Iran, however, while pursuing an anti-status quo agenda that has often brought it into conflict with Israel and the United States, has shown that it seeks to avoid conventional wars and heavy losses to its own forces. Instead, it relies on proxy operations, terrorism, and non-lethal shaping activities. Yet it has occasionally been willing to venture high-risk activities that entail a potential for escalation. Example: Iranian forces in Syria launched an explosive-laden UAV into Israel's airspace in February. It was shot down, but the incident sparked a round of clashes. Israel also seems intent on avoiding war, though its actions show that it's willing to accept the risk of escalation to counter these emerging threats. Indeed, since 2013, it has carried out more than 130 strikes in Syria on arms shipments destined for Hezbollah. And since late 2017, it has expanded this campaign between the wars to target Iranian military facilities in Syria, without thus far sparking a wider confrontation. Complacency is, however, unwarranted. The two major Arab-Israeli confrontations of the recent past, Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza in 2014, resulted from the unintended escalation. The emerging dynamics between Israel, Iran, and the axis of resistance is a formula for a third major accident, and so deserves careful analysis. The potential for yet another war, one of unprecedented scope and complexity, is an outcome of the Syrian civil war, which has enabled Iran to build military infrastructure in Syria and to deploy its Shia Foreign Legion to Israel's borders. War is now possible on multiple fronts and in far-flung theaters fought on land, in the air, at sea, and in the information and cyber domains by fighters from Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even Yemen. The widened scope of a possible war will create new military options for Iran and Hezbollah and stretch Israeli capabilities to their limits. Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said as much, though perhaps with some exaggeration, when he warned in June 2017 that if, quote, an Israeli war is launched against Syria or Lebanon, it is not known that the fighting will remain Lebanese-Israeli or Syrian-Israeli, end of quote. And this could open the way for thousands, even hundreds of thousands of fighters from all over the Arab and Islamic world to participate. Likewise, IRGC Commander Mohammed Ali Jafari stated in November 2017 that, quote, the fate of the resistance from its interwoven resistance front is interwoven and they all stand united. And if Israel attacks a part of it, the other component of the front will help it, end of quote. Such a war is most likely to occur as a result of unintended escalation, after another Iranian action against Israel from Syria, or after an Israeli strike in Lebanon or Syria, for example, against missile production facilities. It could start as a result of a U.S. and/or Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program. It might even come about as a result of conflict that starts in the Gulf but that reaches Israel's borders, perhaps as a result of Iranian moves, much as Saddam Hussein tried in 1991 to derail the U.S. military campaign to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait by launching missiles at Israel. A new northern war could resemble one of the several scenarios. 1. A Lebanon War Plus, a war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon in which Iranians, thousands of foreign Shia fighters, even Hamas, which has established a limited military presence in southern Lebanon, also participate. The Syrian front remains relatively quiet, with Israel acting there on a limited basis to intercept the movement of fighters and capabilities into Lebanon. 2. War in Syria, a war between Israeli and Iranian forces. Shia militias, including Hezbollah fighters, and perhaps even elements of the Syrian military, fought on Syrian territory. The Lebanese front remains relatively quiet. Should Syrian ground forces get drawn into combat, however, Russia might intervene to protect its client. I don't think so, by the way. 3. Two-front war, a war in Lebanon and Syria between Israeli and Iranian troops. Hezbollah, Shia militias, and perhaps even elements of the Syrian military, in which both sides treat Lebanon and Syria as a single unified theater of operations. All three of these scenarios entail a potential for escalation or spillover into secondary fronts or theaters and the involvement of additional actors. Four, additional fronts/theaters. A war in Lebanon and/or Syria might prompt attacks on Israel from Gaza, unrest in the West Bank, or terrorist attacks in Israel. Houthi attacks on Israeli interests such as Israeli maritime traffic in the Bab el-Mandab Strait, or Israeli strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. Missile attacks on Israel by Shia militias in Iraq, and Israeli counterstrikes. Some of these militias have already warned that the latter could trigger attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq. Five, Israel versus Iran. During fighting in Syria or Lebanon, Israel attacks Iran to strike a blow against the central pillar of the enemy coalition and to thereby influence the course of war. Alternatively, Iran augments attacks on Israel from Syria or Lebanon with attacks from its own territory, perhaps after suffering heavy losses in Syria. These could take the form of air or missile strikes and/or destructive cyber attacks on military targets and critical infrastructure. 6. They have thought this through, my friends. 6. A regional war, a low probability, high impact scenario in which a conflict in the Levant morphs into a regional war involving Saudi Arabia and perhaps the United Arab Emirates as well. Israel responds to attacks on its critical infrastructure with airstrikes or cyber attacks on Iran's oil industry or even its nuclear facilities, with the encouragement and perhaps logistical assistance of Gulf Arab states. Iran retaliates against Israel but also conducts missile strikes, sabotage, or cyber attacks on Arab oil facilities across the Gulf, leading to escalation there, and perhaps even military intervention by the United States. Campaign design considerations. For Israel, planning for and fighting the next northern war will entail unprecedented challenges due to uncertainties regarding the number of actors involved, the potential for combat on multiple fronts, theaters, and domains, including cyber, and the role of the great powers. Moreover, because the military capabilities of both sides and the geopolitical environment are rapidly evolving, and because Iran began its entrenchment in Syria only recently, the character of future war will be greatly influenced by its timing. A war in 2019 might be very different from a war in 2025. Despite these uncertainties, recent experiences and current trends permit several generalizations. Israel's next northern war will be far more wide-ranging than prior conflicts. That should have set off a bell in your head. Ding, ding, ding. Psalm 83. Israel may start with an intense air campaign to counter the threat of enemy rocket and missile forces and militia, but effectively dealing with this threat will require large-scale ground operations. Israel's enemies will not be satisfied only with launching rockets and missiles at Israel's military facilities, population centers, and critical infrastructure, but they will try to use ground forces to infiltrate the Israeli lines and to capture Israeli villages and small military outposts. They will also likely employ cyber warfare in support of conventional military operations, for instance, to disrupt Israeli missile defenses, and perhaps against critical infrastructure to achieve strategic effects. In past conflicts with Hezbollah, Israel focused on the organization, military forces, its leadership, military specialists, and elements of the Lebanese infrastructure that facilitated its operations. In the next northern war, the dilemma of whether to prioritize action against immediate threats or enemy centers of gravity and critical enablers will be acute. Substantial efforts need to be invested in identifying centers of gravity that can be targeted to hasten war termination on favorable terms. Russia is a key actor in Syria and could be a key factor in a future war. Will Moscow stand aside, or will it constrain Israel's ability to strike pro-regime forces in Syria to prevent the unraveling of the Assad regime post-2015 civil war gains? And will Washington remain military uninvolved, beyond perhaps augmenting Israeli missile defenses, or will it play a more active role, seeing this as an opportunity to strike a blow against Iran, and thereby advance its goals of undermining the latter influence in the region? Depending how events play out, Israel could face a disquieting possibility. Russian efforts to thwart its use of this decisive force and ineffectual great power diplomacy could prevent Israel from achieving its full military aims. Not entirely unlikely the announcement of the October 7, 1973 war that could ensure a protracted war and perhaps a war that ends without Israel fulfilling its aims. What are some of the challenges of these scenarios? The next northern war will require new operational concepts and a rethinking of Israel's way of war, especially its approach to attaining military decision via defeat mechanisms tailored to its adversaries. The challenge for planners is great because they are dealing with complex emergency threat consisting of many actors, operating on multiple fronts with no single well-defined center of gravity. In addition, there will be many other factors that Israeli military planners will have to consider when grappling with this complex operational environment. Ends, ways, and means. Israel's war aim would be likely be shaped by how far a war begins and its geopolitical context. Would Israel aim to degrade enemy forces and to demoralize them, to disrupt the cohesion of the axis of resistance, discredit the enemy's resistance doctrine, destabilize Syria and/or Iran, or simply reestablish deterrence and bring about a prolonged period of quiet? How many of these goals are attainable? Should Israel focus on Hezbollah and Nasrallah, on Lebanese infrastructure that facilitates Hezbollah's activities, on Iran and IRGC head Soleimani, on the Shia militias, or on the Assad regime? How much emphasis should be placed on targeting the enemy's field forces, military infrastructure, leadership, and motivation morale? And how should Israel prioritize and phase these efforts? Finally, how will Israel resolve the tension between the imperative to end its war quickly in a way that restores deterrence, which will require it to inflict heavy damage on enemy forces that in many cases will be embedded among civilians, and its desires to avoid unnecessary escalation as well as fulfill its obligations of the law of armed conflict? 2. Images of victory. Israel has a much higher bar for success than its enemies. If the axis of resistance can disseminate images of its flag flying over captured Israeli military outposts or villages, where was I? Over captured Israeli military outposts or villages, land, even if subsequently retaken, land blows to Israel's critical infrastructure and continue to launch rockets against Israel on the final day of combat, they will claim victory. It may not be possible, however, for the axis of resistance to preserve the luster of these punitive achievements in the face of significant combat losses and widespread devastation in Lebanon and Syria and even Iran. 3. Scope of operations. Israel has always tried to avoid multi-front wars that require it to split its forces. A key unknown is whether Hezbollah or Iran would try to limit or expand conflict with Israel. Would Hezbollah eschew to fight in Lebanon to preserve its military assets there, avoid widespread destruction to the country's infrastructure, and avert a political backlash? Would Syrian forces actively participate in such a war? Would Iran encourage the Houthis to attack Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, or would the Houthis do so without being asked? Would Hezbollah and Iran launch terror attacks against Israeli interests from the outset of the war, or might they try to de-escalate a potentially devastating conventional conflict in the Levant in order to launch a less risky, low-intensity terrorist war in the shadows against Israel's interests worldwide? And might Israel threaten to bring the war to Lebanon or Iran in order to prevent further escalation and bolster deterrence? I think that's the one that's most plausible when you read Psalm 83. 4. Hezbollah's dilemma. Hezbollah has more than 100,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon, sufficient to overwhelm Israeli defenses, though most are not very accurate. Iran has thousands more, though most cannot reach Israel. After 7 years of civil war, Syria has relatively few missiles left, though it is trying to rebuild its capability. Hezbollah Lebanon-based rocket and missile force is the key to achieving true strategic effects against Israel. And a basic assumption over the past decade is that the next war in Israel's north, Hezbollah will be the main participant. But this may not be the case, because that would invite massive Israeli airstrikes and ground operations and lead to widespread devastation in Lebanon, an outcome Hezbollah would presumably want to avoid. And so its dilemma, how to exploit the potential of its rocket and missile force without destroying Lebanon or jeopardizing the strategic assets, which may be needed later in the war to counter Israeli which may be needed later in the war to counter Israel's moves. This may be why Hezbollah, with Iran's help, is creating its own Syrian and Iraqi proxies to fight for it in the Golan, and why Israel is trying to disrupt some of these efforts. 5. Mobilization potential. Only a fraction of Iran's Shia's foreign legion is based in Syria. Perhaps 10 to 20,000 of the nearly 200,000 foreign fighters it claims to have trained. In the event of an unanticipated war with Israel, it could take weeks for Iran to deploy available militia forces based out of sight of Syria, and Israel would undoubtedly intercept them en route to the front. due to attrition and their relatively low level of training, these forces may not add much to the war effort. 6. Axis of overreach. Axis of resistant members has frequently overreached, for example, Hezbollah versus Israel in 2006, Iran versus Israel in Syria in 2018, and they might do so again by goading Israel into yet another devastating war. This could narrow their post-war military operations, unravel recent hard-won military gains of pro-regime forces in Syria, and further destabilize Lebanon and even Iran. Washington should use the specter of such outcomes to induce Russia to restrain its axis of resistance partners in the wartime. Implications. The next war in Israel's northern front, whether it starts in Lebanon or Syria, will not be just a more extensive, destructive replay of the 2006 Lebanon War. Developments since then ensure that such a war likely involved many more actors, a much larger theater of operation, unprecedented challenges for escalating management, war fighting, and war termination, and the possibility of a regional conflagration. The complexity of the emerging operational environment demands detailed analysis of its implications for the United States and Israel through wargaming, red teaming, and joint planning efforts, development of new Israeli operational concepts, the proper prioritization and phasing of military operations, and the identification and targeting of enemy centers of gravity, and as an active U.S. diplomatic and military posture to ensure that potentially devastating local war does not become a destabilizing and destructive regional conflict. That said, the foregoing assessment suggests several ways the United States and Israel can shape their operational environment to enhance the odds of an outcome compatible with their shared interests with respect to Iran and its axis of resistance should war come. Play on Iran's escalation aversion. Iran generally seeks to avoid or teeter conventional wars, and it's sensitive to threats to the regime and the homeland. Accordingly, U.S. and Israeli decision makers should use the potential for escalation inherent in a possible northern war to teeter Iran from actions that could lead to such a conflict in the first place, or its spread to Iran, which could jeopardize Iran's vital economic interests. If, for example, if the oil infrastructure were to be hit, and the stability of the Assad regime in Syria. Support Israel's campaign between the wars in Syria. Israel attempts to disrupt Iran's military built-up in Syria and already sparked clashes there. Yet such efforts might reduce the need for Israeli preventive action in a crisis, the potential for escalation in wartime, and the amount of damage wrought in a future war. The U.S. government should support these efforts and reinforce Israel's diplomacies with Russia to preserve Israeli military freedom of action in Syria. It should also go quietly. It should also quietly indicate to Russia that a war in Syria might jeopardize Moscow's recent military achievements there by encouraging survival Syrian rebels groups to resume their fight against an enfeebled Assad regime. Why not just keep Hezbollah out? Because of the size of its rocket missile arsenal and its ground forces, keeping the bulk of Hezbollah forces out of northern war, preventing such a war from spreading to Lebanon may greatly facilitate efforts to prevent a limited local war from becoming a much bigger war, and from perhaps sparking a regional conflagration. Keep U.S. forces in Syria. The presence of even a small U.S. military contingent in northeastern Syria might discourage pro-Iranian Shia militias from moving through these areas to the front with Israel during wartime, and limit their movement to a few roads in southeastern Syria, thereby facilitating their interdiction by Israel. For this and a host of other reasons, the U.S. military should retain a limited ground presence in northeastern Syria. Foster Arab-Israeli cooperation. The possibility of war between Israel, Iran, and its axis of resistance raises questions about covert or tactic contributions by various Arab states to a common war effort. Washington should encourage quiet military coordination and cooperation between Israel and these states, which could greatly complicate war planning and war fighting for Iran and its proxies. Ending the war. Conflict termination has posed challenges in recent Arab-Israeli conflicts, and the multiplicity of actors with diverse interests involved in the northern war front will make this even more complicated than before. After the Cold War, the great powers no longer felt a need to intervene to prevent the defeat of their clients or to avoid a superpower confrontation. Russia is back in Syria, however, and it might or might not decide to constrain Israel or its partners in the axis of resistance. Russian behavior, even somewhat ambiguous in practice, can ensure that the next war will be a long one. The challenge for U.S. and Israeli diplomacy is to arrive at sustainable understandings with Russia to ensure that it plays a constructive role during the next war and in efforts to end it. Russia may prove neither willing nor able to do so, but it would be irresponsible not to explore the possibilities. This reality further underscores the need for Israel to develop viable operational concept, new ways of war, and credible defeat mechanisms so that it can decide and terminate future wars on its own terms. Now listen closely as I close with this. And it highlights the need for the United States to remain engaged in the region so that if war comes, it can ensure that Israel has the freedom of action to achieve its war aims and thereby advance U.S. interests in countering and curtailing Iranian influence in the region. Now, this was put out by the Washington Institute. It was done by Major Nadav Ben-Aur of the IDF and also Michael Eisenstadt from the Institute of Khan's Fellow and Director of Military and Security Studies Program. Now, the reason I read this to you, because even though it's not being mentioned much by me and others, because of all the other distractions around the world, including here in the United States, it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of thought being put into this, of all the possibilities and all the players, the multiple fronts. What if this or what if that happens, and how Israel will respond, including the United States. What is my opinion? You already know my opinion. The United States and Israel stay together, and they will fight off the Psalm 83 players that we already looked at that surround the nation of Israel. All of them. They'll go down, just as Scripture has declared it. And they will be confounded. And as it states in Psalm 83, the psalmist, looking ahead, whether he realized it or not, was looking at this war with these confederative nations, Arab nations, coming at Israel to destroy it, as an opportunity that once they're put to shame, that they'll be confounded forever. In verse 16 it says, to fill their faces with shame that they may seek thy name. Even a war as devastating this will be to Israel and the surrounding nations of the Arab world, there's always that hope of deliverance through and by coming to understanding that you are following a false God, you are following a false doctrine, including even Israel. Not a false God, but not the only begotten Son of Jesus Christ. And they are I believe, going to be confounded, and their faces will be filled with shame. And hopefully that draws the surviving populations in these nations that necessarily are not participants in the war as soldiers to come to an understanding that it's the one true God they need to seek their face, His face, so they can know what's stated here in verse 18, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth. The groundwork is being laid out. The studies are being made. The generals are trying to figure it all out and put it together, just in case the attack does come, and it will come. The scenarios are being played out. This is not going to be a surprise to the United States or to Israel. They're expecting it. How soon? Only time will tell. But it was closer than it was the last time I preached on the Psalm 83 war. And it's probably just around the corner. How far that corner is, only God knows. But the groundwork is being laid. The nations that are the enemies of Israel are seething, they're boiling over, they're in a situation where they want to take crafty counsel. And crafty counsel against who? The chosen and the hidden ones. That, as I pointed out before, it's Israel and the United States. How they could be defeated in the area, in the Middle East, so the advancement of Islam and the destruction of Israel can take place. And let me tell you right now, God knew that. That's why the end result is devastation to the enemy. Because if the enemy did win in this case, and Israel be toppled, and the United States would be defeated in the Middle East, guess what? Scriptures would have to be rewritten. But they don't have to be. It's going to come to pass. God's going to have the last word. I'm keeping my eye on the Middle East. Even there's a lot of other things that are happening that are a distraction. I mean, don't be fooled about these Kavanaugh hearings. This is all about abortion, control. And whether Roe versus Wade would be overturned. But a bigger fight is coming. They call it the Great Middle Eastern War of 2019. I don't know if it's 2019, 2020, whatever it's going to be. It's coming. And that's just the first, probably, of many wars. Now, Iran might get attacked before even that. And that's a whole other part of the series that we've been looking at and I'm going to go back to. But whatever war comes first, I believe Iran will be dealt with. I believe the Arab states will be dealt with. And then comes the Gog-Magog war. And that's going to be involved with players that are not going to be involved in this war. Primarily, Turkey as the ringleader. But that's another subject for another time. I just wanted to give you a quick update. I found this article interesting. If you want to get a copy for it yourself, put in your files. It's the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Great Middle Eastern War of 2019. Now, play a song. I found it interesting how not necessarily Christians are understanding what's about ready to take place, but the military personnel and the securities, organizations that run securities across this country. When I say securities, I mean how to keep nations, pretty much in layman's terms, under control by using certain security measures that certain things wouldn't happen, that would bring it to a place where it's out of control. But they can't even control this. So, bottom line, it's an interesting read. Everyone should get a copy for their own files and pull it out periodically and say, oh, this is just a prelude to what needs to happen for an Psalm 83 war to take place. You got it? I want to hear from you.